On the show today, the U.S., Israel, and Egypt reach an agreement to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza.
He agreed that what he would do is open the gate on to do two things. One, let up to 20 trucks through to begin with.
Plus, protests grow violent at the U.S. Embassy in Beirut.
Lebanese security forces used tear gas to disperse protesters who threw Molotov cocktails and caused a fire that was later contained. On Wednesday, hundreds of protesters returned to the embassy, where they were kept far from the perimeter and again met with tear gas and water cannon.
And later, a look at the diplomatic situation surrounding the Israel-Hamas war. Today is Thursday, October 19th, and this is VOA's International Edition. From VOA headquarters in Washington, I'm Steve Karish. As we'll hear later in the show, protests erupted across the Middle East and many parts of the world following the blast at a hospital in Gaza on Tuesday. In fact, hundreds of protesters calling for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas gathered at the U.S. Capitol on Wednesday. Many of the demonstrators were affiliated with a group called Jewish Voices for Peace. Over 200 protesters were arrested. All this comes as President Joe Biden returns to Washington after visiting Israel. The president had planned to attend a summit in Amman with leaders from Jordan, Egypt, and the Palestinian Authority, but that was called off after Tuesday's deadly blast. However, before leaving Israel, Biden called Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi from his plane to discuss getting humanitarian aid into Gaza through an Egyptian border crossing. Biden said that Egypt has agreed to open a border crossing into Gaza to allow in trucks with humanitarian aid. Here's President Biden speaking with reporters on Air Force One.
When we took off, my goal was multifold, but basically to get humanitarian aid into Gaza and get as many Americans out who wanted to get out, could get out, as possible. And so we got a commitment, as you know, from the Israelis, including their unanimous vote of their war cabinet and the prime minister. And the second thing was that I wanted to make sure there was a vehicle, a mechanism that this could happen quickly. And so I've been on the phone for the last, we've been on the ground a while. That's why we haven't taken off with el-Sisi. I don't think I was on that long. It was about probably half an hour. And both my team here was with me. And he agreed that what he would do is open the gate on to do two things. One, let up to 20 trucks through to begin with.
Biden said he was blunt in his approach with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu when it came to safeguarding and helping civilians.
And I was, they probably told you, I was very blunt with the Israelis. Because look, Israel has been badly victimized, but the truth is that if they have an opportunity to relieve suffering of people who have nowhere to go, they're going to be, it's what they should do. And if they don't, they'll be held accountable in ways that may be unfair, but that's what we should. And my point to everyone is, look, if you have an opportunity to alleviate the pain, you should do it, period. And if you don't, you're going to lose credibility worldwide.
Biden was in Tel Aviv on Wednesday to show support for Israel following the October 7th attack by Hamas. While in Tel Aviv, Biden appeared to side with Israel, which has denied responsibility for the massive explosion at a Gaza hospital that killed hundreds, ignited protests around the region, and scuttled Biden's summit with regional leaders. White House Bureau Chief Patsy Widakuswara has this report.
Arriving in Tel Aviv Wednesday to show support for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, President Joe Biden said he was deeply saddened and outraged by the hospital explosion.
Based on the information we've seen to date, it appears the result of an errant rocket fired by a terrorist group in Gaza.
Biden said Israel has agreed that humanitarian assistance can begin to move from Egypt to Gaza and announced $100 million U.S. aid for Palestinians. He vowed to provide Israel what it needs to defend itself, but urged restraint in its retaliation.
You live by the rule of law. And when conflicts flare, you live by the law of wars.
Netanyahu thanked Biden for his support. His government has pounded Gaza with airstrikes, killing 3,000 people, and ordered 2 million Gazans to evacuate ahead of an expected ground invasion in response to the militant group Hamas' brazen incursion on October 7th, which killed 1,400 people.
Hamas is responsible and should be held accountable for all civilian casualties.
Hamas blamed the hospital blast on an Israeli airstrike, while Israel said it was an errant rocket from the militant group Islamic Jihad. That group also denied responsibility. The hospital was considered a haven for Gazans fleeing Israeli attacks.
I don't know. A missile fell on us. We were on the floor. Everything got destroyed. We were destroyed.
The explosion and Israeli retaliation to Hamas have ignited massive protests in various cities, including in Lebanon, Jordan, Iran, Iraq, Tunisia, and Turkey. Demonstrators laid the blame on Israel. In Tel Aviv, Biden met with Israeli survivors of the October 7th Hamas attack. He had been scheduled to head next to Amman to meet leaders of Jordan, Egypt, and the Palestinian Authority, but the summit and the Jordan leg of the trip were scrapped following the blast. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News.
Delivering humanitarian aid to the people who need it most during a conflict can be dangerous, even deadly. Many involved, including UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, are calling for a ceasefire to allow aid to get where it needs to go. VOA's Celia Mendoza is in Israel and discussed that angle of the story with my colleague Steve Miller.
Has there been any discussions on the Israeli side, from what you're hearing there, that there could be a potential ceasefire to allow the humanitarian evacuation of civilians?
So far, we have not heard the possibility, at least from the Israeli government, of a ceasefire. We have heard that leaders of Hamas spoke about that in the past few days, that they will be willing to get some of the hostages out if it was a ceasefire. But so far, the conversations have not been able to move forward in the possibility of a ceasefire. And that is something that actually was said by the government of Israel yesterday before Biden's visit, in which they were very clear that even though the president of the United States he was coming into Israel, their military plans are not going to change. And they have been very clear that they continue into their next phase of military action, and that will include air, ground, and sea operations. So it is not impossible, but so far we have not heard anything official that a ceasefire might be possible. Doesn't mean that it's not in the works. And that's part of the reason probably that President Biden decided to come to the ground. He has said that face-to-face diplomacy is the best solution. He is very experienced as a senator. He was on the Foreign Affairs Committee. He during his work as vice president, he was in charge of a lot of the foreign affairs dealings during the Obama administration. And he has committed himself, and he said it again, to work in this conflict and to try to find a solution. And a ceasefire might be a possibility. We know that the Secretary General of the United Nations has worked with some of the diplomats of the United States. They're been working together. Just a few days, Mr. Martin Griffith, who is in charge of the emergency assistance, visited the area, and the visit of the Secretary General to Egypt will be another way to try to push for those agreements, especially now as the world is watching how the number of civilians getting hurt or displaced or killed is growing exponentially in Gaza.
Celia Mendoza reports for VOA, normally from the State Department here in Washington for the LATAM service, but currently in Jerusalem, Israel. Celia, thank you very much for your time, and please stay safe.
Thank you so much.
And as we've mentioned, protesters have staged anti-Israel rallies around the Middle East on Wednesday, some of them turning violent to voice rage at an explosion that killed hundreds of Palestinians at a hospital in Gaza. Israeli forces killed 2 Palestinian teenagers during protests near Ramallah, and Palestinian authorities fired tear gas to disperse protesters throwing rocks elsewhere in the West Bank. And in Lebanon, security forces fired tear gas and water cannon at protesters who were throwing projectiles at a protest near the U.S. Embassy north of Beirut. VOA's Jacob Russell is there.
Protests outside the U.S. Embassy in Beirut after a massive explosion killed hundreds of Palestinians at a hospital in Gaza on Tuesday. Palestinian authorities blame the explosion on an Israeli airstrike. Israel says it was caused by a misfired rocket originating inside Gaza. After the strike, the Lebanese militant political group Hezbollah called for a day of rage in Lebanon and across the region. Protesters in Beirut, many affiliated with Hezbollah, gathered and headed to the U.S. Embassy to vent their anger. Israel has no diplomatic relations with Lebanon and therefore no embassy in the country. America's staunch support of Israel during its bombing campaign in Gaza, in spite of massive civilian casualties, has made the US a target of anger in Lebanon. Lebanese security forces used tear gas to disperse protesters who threw Molotov cocktails and caused a fire that was later contained. On Wednesday, hundreds of protesters returned to the embassy where they were kept far from the perimeter and again met with tear gas and water cannon. VOA News saw injuries amongst protesters and another fire break out, although not within the embassy compound. Many in Lebanon have watched with increasing anger as civilian casualties in Gaza mount and few Western governments call for Israeli restraint. At the same time, Hezbollah and the Israeli military have traded fire on the border, threatening to drag Lebanon and the wider region into a potentially devastating war. Jacob Russell, VOA News, Beirut.
And here are other stories we're following from around the world. The United States is still without a Speaker of the House of Representatives. On Wednesday, for the second day in a row, Republican Representative Jim Jordan, a hardline conservative and staunch ally of former President Donald Trump, lost his bid to be elected Speaker by the full House. The lawyer representing the family of Mahsa Amini, the 22-year-old Iranian woman who died in police custody last year, has been sentenced to a year in prison after being convicted of conducting propaganda against the regime. Saleh Nekbat was charged after he discussed Amini's case in interviews with media outlets. He was sentenced on Tuesday. Ukrainian officials said Wednesday that a Russian missile attack in the city of Zaporizhia killed at least 2 people and wounded 5 others. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the missile hit a 5-story residential building. And 2 tourists, a newlywed couple, were killed along with their tour guide in an attack near a Ugandan national park. The honeymooners, a South African woman and British man, died when assailants set their tour vehicle on fire near Queen Elizabeth National Park, which is in a remote area of southwestern Uganda near the Congo border. Ugandan police are blaming the Allied Democratic Forces, or ADF, for the attack. The ADF is a rebel group active in a lawless part of eastern Congo and has ties with the Islamic State group. As we've heard, Tuesday's blast at a hospital in Gaza has complicated diplomatic efforts between Israel and Hamas. It caused the cancellation of a regional summit and has sparked anti-Israel and anti-America protests around the region. For a closer look at the diplomatic implications of all this, I'm joined by VOA's senior diplomatic correspondent, Cindy Sain. Well, so much of what Antony Blinken was trying to achieve in his earlier meetings was preventing this conflict from becoming a wider, more regional war. How can the United States achieve that objective if Jordan, if Egypt, if the Palestinians won't sit down with the United States?
Well, it wasn't quite, as televised or as public. But even after the explosion, Palestinian Authority President Abbas did, in fact, sit down with Secretary Blinken. So there are still contacts going back and forth. And some experts that I've spoken with say, understanding the outrage and the protests that we're seeing in a lot of places in the Middle East, a lot of Arab countries against Israel, against the United States, that it was clear that at that moment it would have been very difficult for Abbas and for Jordan's King Abdullah to meet with the U.S. But it might be just more of a prudent internal domestic thing for them, seeing what's going on in their streets as not really so much an indication that they are not willing to still work behind the scenes with the United States. And I'm sure that Secretary Blinken, that the diplomacy is still ongoing.
One of the things that has been in the news a lot, in fact, it was on this program yesterday, was concerns from Israel's northern border with Lebanon and fears that Hezbollah might start some fighting up there as well. Hezbollah is, of course, it's linked to Iran, but it's not a state actor, if you will. It's not the government of Lebanon. Hamas is not an official state government. How do these non-state actors complicate the traditional diplomatic roles that other countries would have?
Right, that's an excellent question, and they definitely do complicate things. And I know that Israelis' defense forces are saying they are indeed bracing for a possible Hezbollah attack from the north and conceding that Hezbollah would be a much stronger enemy than Hamas, and that any attacks on Israel from Hezbollah would be deadly, and saying that they are trying to prepare for these attacks as they were seemingly caught off guard by the Hamas attacks. And behind the scenes, again, the U.S. Is having conversations even with China, because I think neither the U.S. nor China has really an interest that Hezbollah and its backer, Iran, get into this conflict and that there's a second or third front.
Cindy Sain is VOA's senior diplomatic correspondent. And Cindy, thanks for your time on this.
Thank you.
From Washington, it's VOA's International Edition. I'm Steve Karish. Now, in other diplomatic news, the United States and Turkey are growing more suspicious of each other, each side accusing the other of posing a security threat. The war of words follows the U.S. downing of a Turkish drone that Washington said was threatening American forces in Syria. Dorian Jones reports from Istanbul.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan accuses American forces in Syria of posing a security threat to Turkey. The U.S. troops support rebels with the Syrian Democratic Forces Group in its war against the Islamic State militant group. But Ankara believes the SDF is linked to Kurdish insurgents in Turkey. The dispute between the NATO allies escalated when U.S. forces downed a Turkish drone this month, claiming it posed a threat and causing fury in Ankara. Mesut Çarşın is a presidential advisor at Istanbul's Yeditepe University.
It is an unacceptable big mistake. One NATO member cannot fire, even though it's unmanned aircraft. If we'll continue this situation, in Syria we may be fight with the United States of America. I say really. This is very dangerous. Not for America, for the whole region, peace and stability.
The Turkish military has been stepping up its airstrikes against the SDF after this month's suicide bomb attack on Ankara by the militant Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK. But Washington, in a statement, rejected Ankara's calls to end its support of the SDF and accused Turkey of undermining the war against the Islamic State group, also known as ISIS. Aaron Stein of the Philadelphia-based Foreign Policy Research Institute.
The tensions have ratcheted up such that the U.S. isn't prepared to allow an allied drone to overfly its own bases in the region. And that's new. And those tensions are considerable because fundamentally, right, if you look at sort of broader U.S. interests, the U.S. has decided that the counterterrorism mission is in its interest in Syria. and that the withdrawal would allow for ISIS, or potentially allow for ISIS, to regain a foothold and come back.
Observers warn the increasing bilateral tensions are impacting efforts to contain the crisis over Hamas's attack against Israel. Asla Aydin-Taşbaş is with the Brookings Institution in Washington.
We've noticed that Secretary Tony Blinken is not passing by Turkey, going to Turkey, or having an intense conversation with his Turkish counterpart, even though Turkey is clearly a country that has a very close relationship with Hamas leadership and can play a role in terms of releasing of hostages. It shows a schism. President Erdogan does not like to be ignored. There's also no trust between the two sides. You do really need confidence-building measures.
Erdogan's increasingly fiery remarks about Israel over its war against Hamas also target Washington for supplying military aid to Israel. Analysts say Washington may be too distracted by events in the region to address tensions with Turkey. Aaron Stein of the Philadelphia-based Foreign Policy Research Institute.
With the region, with Israel, Hamas, and all these things, it does seem like those tensions, at least the focus of U.S. foreign policy in this region, is now on Israel-Hamas and not necessarily on managing the U.S.-Turkey relationship.
Observers warn that with the Israel-Hamas war raging, any decision by Washington to ignore Ankara, either deliberately or by neglect, could cause tensions to rise across the region. Dorian Jones, VOA News, Istanbul.
And that's going to wrap it up for us today. This has been International Edition on the Voice of America. On behalf of everyone at VOA, thanks for joining us. For pictures, stories, videos, and more, follow VOA News on your favorite social media platform and online at voanews.com. Until next time, I'm Steve Karish in Washington. Stay safe and have a great day.
Next, an editorial reflecting the views of the United States government.
Since the creation in 1963 of the World Food Program, hunger has never reached such devastating highs as today. Nearly 350 million people are experiencing extreme hunger, with 49 million on the brink of famine. There is little doubt that food security depends on fertile soils and crops adapted to climate change. It's why the United States, the African Union, and the UN Food and Agriculture Organization launched the Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils, or VACS. VACS aims to foster more resilient food systems by developing climate-resilient, nutritious crop varieties and building healthy, fertile soils, said Dr. Carrie Fowler, the State Department's Special Envoy for Global Food Security. Initially, we're focusing back on Africa. It's the region with the greatest need and the greatest potential. On the crop side of the program, VACS is implementing a three-step program.
Over-reliance on a few staples is risky, and in the best of years, it can't provide an adequate diet or balanced nutrition for everyone. The good news is that Africa is rich with nutritious traditional and indigenous crops.
Expanding the spotlight and investments in these crops can unlock the potential to provide better nutrition, rebuild soils, support local communities and their cultures, and strengthen resilience, said Dr. Fowler.
The first step was to look at all those traditional and indigenous crops in Africa and ask which of those crops have the most potential for providing more nutrition. We narrowed the list down from 300 to 60. The next step is going to be to look at those 60 crops and ask, how are they going to do in a climate-changed world? On the basis of knowing which crops have the most nutritional value and most potential to provide good production in Africa, we can make informed decisions on crop breeding and other efforts.
The third step, said Dr. Fowler, is to establish the mechanisms needed to support that kind of work in a sustainable and in a fundamental way.
This doesn't mean that the United States or any of us involved are abandoning our work on major crops. It simply means that we're adding to this and taking advantage of the really tremendous benefits that some of these traditional and indigenous crops offer.
The program, said Dr. Fowler, is not going to solve all problems. No program could. But it does address two fundamental prerequisites for food security: having good soils and having good crops.
That was an editorial reflecting the views of the United States government.